gracious God, grant us always to seek the truth, come whence it may, cost what it will. Amen. So the story we just heard from Matthew's Gospel about Jesus feeding more than 5,000 people, called the miracle of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, is the only one of these miracle stories about Jesus that's included in all 4 of the Gospels. Each writer tells it a little bit differently, include little different bits of information, different bits of details, but the bones of the stories they tell are the same. Thousands of people following Jesus are hungry at the end of a long day, and there's just a small amount of food available to feed them. Now, in John's version of the story, it's a young boy who provides the loaves and the fishes. And in Luke, some details we're told are that they're all near a town called Bethsaida. And in Mark, as well as Luke, the crowds sit down on the grass in groups of 50 or 100. So there's some little details that are different that some include, some don't. But in each of the 4, Jesus has withdrawn to a deserted or private place. And that's where we enter the story today in Matthew's Gospel, as Jesus withdraws in a boat to a deserted place. Well, why? Why is he doing that? And as I reread this story throughout the past week, I kept wondering about why this miracle story, what about this story of feeding people is so compelling that each of the gospel writers, including John, because John doesn't, John kind of does his own thing, but all of them include this story. So what is it that's so compelling that each of them includes this in their narrative of Jesus's life and ministry? Because there are plenty of other miracle stories that seem as compelling to me. Turning water into wine, or raising Lazarus from the dead, or calming a storm. But none of them are included in all 4 like this one. So what's going on in this story? So as always, it's really important to look at the text around the section that we read so that we can put it in context. We don't just yank it out and take it on its own, but what is the context? Why are we hearing this story? And when we do that, we find that the impetus for Jesus's retreat or withdrawal to a private place is that he's just learned of the death of John. His friend, his cousin, his mentor, John the Baptist, has been murdered. And that's what he has heard. And that's what compels him to step away. And the crowds have heard it too. So you see, the line preceding where our sentence starts for our gospel today reads like this. When Jesus heard this, the news of John, which is the story right above it, of John's death, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. So when he heard of the news of John's death, he withdrew. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot. Jesus was grieving. And he needed some time. He needed to go and be alone. But the crowds heard it and they followed him. Why? Because they were grieving too. They would have known John, or at the very least, they would have known about John. Perhaps some, even maybe many, would have been followers of John. John had a large and popular ministry, remember, preparing the way for Jesus. So he would have been well known, and his death would have been upsetting for everyone who heard it. So Jesus retreats to this quiet place upon hearing this news. And perhaps he gets a bit of time alone before the crowds all of a sudden show up. And what does it tell us he does in the midst of this? He has compassion for them. He enters into their midst to comfort them, to heal the suffering among them. And I wonder if doing this was part of how he processed John's death himself. Did being among others who were grieving give him comfort too? Did helping them help him grieve too? And then we move on in this story, right? The evening has arrived and the people are hungry. So the disciples come to Jesus wondering if they should just send them on their way to go get some food into the local towns, to go and buy the food for themselves because we don't have enough, they tell Jesus. And he says, what do you have? We only have 5 loaves of bread and a couple fish. And Jesus says, that's good. Bring it here. And he tells the people to sit down. Remember, in all the other accounts, they sit in small groups. They don't sit as a mass like on the hill at Pine Knob. They get into their small groups. And he blesses the food, and every single one of them are able to eat. And there are leftovers. And I'm reminded when I hear this story of an amazing sermon Pastor Beth Taylor preached a couple years ago, maybe a year ago, about this particular story. I think it was either in Mark's gospel or Luke's gospel. And the idea that the miracle wasn't that somehow Jesus did magic and produced a whole bunch of extra food, but rather that when the crowd gathered into smaller groups, they likely had food with them. They wouldn't have traveled for long periods of time without taking something with them, just like we throw a granola bar, a protein bar, or something into our bags when we leave for the day. They brought food with them. And when they sat down in these small groups, they shared that with one another. And miraculously, there was plenty of food for everybody. And there were even leftovers. So taking all of that together, again, I ask, why this story? Now that is compelling. That is all very compelling. But so compelling that all 4 writers had to include it. There must be more to it. I think this story is about much more than feeding people. I think this story is meant to show us what a model of beloved community looks like, how followers of Jesus are meant to live. Because remember, the story follows right after Jesus has used a whole bunch of parables to try to tell us, to give us a vision for the kingdom of heaven on earth. Remember, he gives us all those parables that we read from chapter 13 over the last few weeks. He keeps saying this again and again. The kingdom of heaven is like. It is like what? It is like wheat and weeds growing together. It is like a mustard seed. It is like yeast. And what did all of those parables tell us then about the kingdom of heaven? Told us it's here on earth, for one thing, and it is evident in certain ways. It is evident when justice and compassion and love are present, so that everyone has a place to live, so that everyone has food to eat, so that everyone is welcome when no one is ever excluded. These are the messages hidden in those parables, messages that contradicted the prevailing culture of Jesus' time and, frankly, of our time. So this story of the feeding of the 5,000, I think this puts those messages into action. So he keeps telling us, here's what it is. It's like this. It's like this. And now I'm going to show you. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like in the world. What does it look like? Well, there's death. A beloved friend has died, and all those who loved him gathered together to grieve his loss. They console one another. I imagine they sat down in their small groups and they told stories, and they shared their memories of John. And then they shared their food with one another. And Jesus moves among them, blessing their generosity and multiplying it, because that's what he does. That's what he does in us. His presence gives them comfort and strength, belief that they will move forward when the grieving is done. This is a picture of the church in the world. Think of all the times we have gathered as a community when someone among us has experienced a loss. We've come together to grieve, to console and comfort one another, to share a meal and tell stories, and to give thanks for the generosity and love of this community. And I've realized we have been doing this in so many different ways during this time of physical separation from one another. I kept seeing St. John's as I'm reading this story, amazingly, of masses of people gathered together, but I kept seeing St. John's, even though we are not gathered together. We have fed each other. in these last number of months with little more than a phone call or a postcard, a beautifully sewn mask, or a new set of pillowcases, a freshly baked loaf of bread, a little jar of honey made by our bees and lovingly harvested by our beekeepers, fresh produce grown in our garden, the grounds around the building mulched and weeded and cleaned up, the inside of our building cleaned and prepared for us to be together, to be safe when we are able to do that. It has reminded me that it doesn't take much for the church to be the church, for the people of God to embody the kingdom of heaven as Jesus has been telling us it looks like and it acts like. We have so much in abundance in a world that wants us to think there is only scarcity. We have so much in abundance. We have so much greater wealth. And I have marveled at St. John's over these past months as we've pivoted and adapted and grown and changed together. And even welcomed new people into our community in the midst of all of this. New people have found us and said, man, this is where I belong. I feel like we're living this story of the feeding of the 5,000, gathered sometimes in small groups, in person or online, grieving together the losses we are each experiencing during this pandemic, and we are. The loss of time with family or friends, the loss of school and camps for kids, the loss of jobs or time to be alone. And we are also celebrating. We're celebrating the joys we could never have imagined might come during a time like this. Time to discuss a book with friends or learn a new technology that helps us stay connected. Time when families are making meals together that they've never had time to do before, or playing games or building puzzles, doing things they haven't done as a family in years. I feel like this is our story for our time, St. John's. We are the church. Jesus is showing us in this story. And we are continually becoming this church as we grow together, seeking who and where God is calling us to serve, whether it's one another or the world around us. Jesus is showing us in this story that it's not just about a couple loaves of bread or a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. It's about who we are to one another and how we journey together. And what Christian community, what a faithful Christian community looks like in the world. And I have to tell you, St. John's looks like it in the world. As I see the people go through open hands yesterday and give thanks for the fact that they got food. And then the next car that pulls in hands a check out the window to say, man, I love what y'all are doing. Here's some to keep it going. I've heard about you guys. I know about St. John's. Here's something to help you keep going. That's what it looks like to feed 5,000 and more. And we are doing it again and again and again, in small ways and in large ways. Thanks be to God, St. John's. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Amen.